A woman with cracked hands and no running water kept 6 children alive on $11 a month, and she never once wrote down how she did it. It was 1936, in a farmhouse with a dirt floor somewhere between Missouri and nowhere, and the wind came through the walls at night like it owned the place. Doctors today will tell you a family cannot survive on what she had. They will tell you the math does not work, the calories do not add up, the odds were impossible. And yet she did it, and so did millions like her, because they carried a kind of knowledge that never made it into a single book, a single pamphlet, a single lesson plan. It lived in their hands, in their habits, in the things they did without thinking, because thinking about it was a luxury they could not afford. Number 25 on this list is a rule so simple you have probably broken it today without even noticing, and it is the reason half the food in your refrigerator is already dying. Number 14 on this list was quietly outlawed in parts of this country, not because it was dangerous, but because it was too cheap and too effective for certain industries to tolerate. And number 1, the very last rule, is not a trick at all. It is the reason everything else on this list worked, and once you hear it, you will understand why your grandparents could survive things that would break most people alive today. For decades, a wave of convenience marketing, processed food advertising, and quiet regulatory pressure worked together to erase these habits from American memory, replacing hard-won household wisdom with something easier to sell and harder to trust. This is what they buried. Let us count them down. Number 25. Waste nothing that once had a heartbeat or a root. In the 1930s, a chicken was not dinner, it was 4 dinners and a soup and a pillow. The meat went to the table, the bones went into a pot that simmered on the back of the stove for 2 days straight, the fat was rendered down into a jar that sat on the windowsill and lasted for months, and the feathers, clean and dried, went into pillowcases and quilts that outlived the people who made them. Nothing hit the trash pile that still had use left in it. This habit died with the rise of pre-packaged meat cuts in the 1950s, when the meat industry realized that selling you only the muscle, and throwing away the bones, the fat, and the organs before you ever saw them, meant you had to buy more often. Today nutritionists are quietly rediscovering that bone broth carries collagen and minerals that boxed stock never had. Your great-grandmother did not need a study to tell her that. She just knew a chicken owed you more than one meal. The smell alone told you the work was worth it, a slow simmer of bone and marrow filling a small kitchen for 2 straight days, thick enough by the end that it would set into a soft jelly overnight in the cold pantry. Even the skin, if it wasn't used for cracklings in the pan, went into the pot too, because fat carried flavor and flavor carried a family through a bland winter. Children in these households grew up understanding, without ever being taught in words, that an animal's life was owed a kind of respect measured in how completely it was used. That single idea, waste nothing, quietly shaped how an entire generation approached everything else they owned. Number 24. Keep a fire that never truly dies. In homes without electricity, banking a fire at night, burying the coals under a bed of ash so they would still be glowing embers by morning, was not a chore, it was survival math. Starting a fire from nothing costs time, fuel, and risk. Keeping one alive costs almost nothing. Families in the Ozarks and the Appalachian Hollows could tell you exactly how deep to bury the coals depending on the wood, the wind, and the season, knowledge passed down through nothing but watching an older hand do it 100 times. When gas and electric heating spread through rural America in the decades after the war, this skill simply had no reason to survive, and an entire generation lost the quiet confidence of knowing they could keep their family warm with nothing but ash and patience. Anyone who has ever woken to a genuinely cold house during a winter power outage knows exactly how much that confidence is worth. The old-timers did not panic during storms the way modern households often do, because a dead power line meant almost nothing to a home that already knew how to warm itself the older way. There was a particular smell to a properly banked fire in the morning too, faint wood smoke and warm ash, a smell that told a half-asleep child the house had survived the night just fine before anyone even opened their eyes. Number 23. Mend it before you replace it. A torn shirt was not thrown away, it was turned inside out, patched, and worn until the patches needed patches. Darning socks was a nightly ritual for many women, done by lamplight with a wooden egg slipped inside the heel to keep the shape true. This was not because people enjoyed sewing. It was because a new shirt cost real money, and real money was the scarcest resource in the house. The rise of cheap, mass-produced clothing in the later 20th century made mending feel almost embarrassing, a sign of poverty rather than a sign of competence. Today, with clothing prices climbing again, more people are quietly relearning what a needle and thread can save them. A basket of mending sat by nearly every chair in the house, ready to be picked up during any spare quiet moment, while listening to the radio or waiting for bread to rise. Children learn to sew almost as early as they learn to walk, not as a hobby but as a basic household expectation, the same way a modern child might learn to tie their own shoes. A well-mended garment was worn with a kind of quiet pride rather than shame, because everyone in the community understood exactly what that patch represented: care, thrift, and the refusal to let a useful thing go to waste simply because it had a tear in it. Number
Keep that
22.
hat on tight, the sun is high.
Read the sky before you read the news.
Is this crate full yet?
Long
Almost.
before
Throw
weather
yours in here.
satellites, farm families could tell a storm was coming from the color of the sunset, the direction the smoke from the chimney leaned, and the way certain birds went silent. A red sky at night meant a clear day tomorrow. A ring around the moon meant rain within 3 days. These were not superstitions plucked from thin air, they were generations of pattern recognition, tested against real crops and real lives, because a wrong guess about the weather could mean a lost harvest and a hungry winter. Modern meteorology has actually confirmed the atmospheric science behind many of these old sayings, but by the time the confirmation came, most people had already stopped looking up. Number 21. Preserve the harvest like your life depends on it, because it did. Canning, root cellaring, smoking, salting, and drying were not hobbies, they were the difference between a family eating in February or not. A root cellar dug into a hillside could keep potatoes, carrots, and cabbages fresh for months using nothing but the constant cool temperature of the earth itself, no electricity required. Families would spend entire weeks in late summer canning tomatoes, beans, and peaches, filling shelf after shelf with glass jars that would carry them through the leanest months. This knowledge nearly vanished when supermarket refrigeration convinced an entire country that fresh produce would simply always be available, a promise that recent supply chain disruptions have proven to be far more fragile than anyone assumed. Building a proper root cellar was itself a small engineering project, dug at an angle into a north-facing slope where the ground stayed coolest, lined with stone or timber, and fitted with a simple vent to keep air moving so the stored vegetables didn't rot from trapped moisture. Families would check the cellar almost daily through the winter months, pulling out spoiling items before they could spread to the rest of the store, a small daily ritual that kept an entire winter's food supply intact through nothing but attentiveness and a bit of dug-out earth. Open your ears for a moment, because before we go further, there is a story worth telling. In a small town in Kentucky, a woman named Ruth kept a root cellar that had fed 3 generations of her family through wars, droughts, and a flood that took half the county's crops in a single night. When her grandchildren finally cleared out the cellar after she passed, they found jars dated decades apart, each one labeled in her careful handwriting, a quiet record of a woman who never trusted the future to take care of itself. She did not do this because she distrusted people. She did it because she had lived through years when trust alone did not fill a plate. That is the thread running through everything on this list, and it is the thread modern convenience has slowly, quietly cut. Number 20. This is a main event, so settle in. Know your land better than you know your own reflection. A farmer in the 1930s could walk his property blindfolded and tell you where the soil turned to clay, where the water pooled after rain, where the shade fell longest in July, and where the frost hit hardest in October. This was not casual familiarity, it was survival intelligence built over years of daily observation, because planting the wrong crop in the wrong patch of ground could cost a family their entire year's food supply. Industrial agriculture, with its uniform fields and chemical inputs designed to override natural soil variation, made this kind of deep local knowledge feel unnecessary almost overnight. Large agribusiness companies profited enormously from convincing farmers that fertilizer and pesticide could replace generations of observation with a bag from the store. But soil scientists today are increasingly returning to the old wisdom, mapping microclimates and soil variation within single fields, essentially rediscovering with satellites and sensors what a sharp-eyed farmer once knew simply by walking his own dirt. He could crumble a handful of soil between his fingers and tell you, almost to the week, when it would be ready for planting. He knew which corner of the field flooded first after a hard rain and which ridge dried out fastest under a July sun, and he planted accordingly, without needing a single instrument to confirm it. That kind of intimate, earned knowledge cannot be purchased in a bag of fertilizer, no matter how the label markets it, and something real was lost the moment farmers were convinced they no longer needed to know their own ground that closely. Number 19. Never let water go to waste.
Well, I think we have a deal then.
Rain barrels sat under
Sounds
every
good to me.
downspout. Dishwater was
Glad we
safe
could
to
work
feed
it
the
out.
garden, and washing water from Monday's laundry often became
See the
Tuesday's
shape of
floor
this
scrubbing
leaf,
water
sweetie?
before it was finally
It's different
poured onto
from
the
the others.
compost pile.
It's pointy.
Water was not an infinite resource that arrived magically from a tap. It was something you carried, stored, and rationed with intention. This habit faded almost completely once indoor plumbing became standard, and an entire culture of water consciousness disappeared within a single generation. Drought-stricken regions of the country are now scrambling to
Here's
relearn
your flour
rainwater harvesting
and the
techniques
eggs.
that their own
Much
great-grandparents practiced without a second thought. A single rain barrel positioned under the right downspout could collect enough water in a single storm to keep a vegetable garden alive through an entire dry week, and families tracked rainfall the way modern households track a bank balance, carefully, and with real attention to what was coming in versus what was going out. Nothing about this required special equipment or expense, only the habit of noticing water as something valuable rather than something that simply appeared whenever a handle was turned. Number 18. Trust the cast iron, not the coating. A single cast iron skillet, seasoned properly with rendered fat and used daily, could last 100 years and only get better with time. It went from stovetop to open fire to oven without complaint, and a well-seasoned pan was naturally resistant to sticking without a single chemical coating. When non-stick cookware exploded in popularity in the mid-20th century, marketed heavily as a modern convenience, cast iron was pushed aside as old-fashioned and difficult. Decades later, health concerns emerged around certain non-stick chemical coatings, and cast iron sales have quietly surged again, with a new generation discovering what their grandmothers never
Pull
stopped
hard
believing,
now, all
that the old
together.
pan was never actually the problem.
We got it.
Number
Steady,
17.
steady.
Yes, look at that.
Keep
we
your
did
hands
it.
busy in the dark months. Winter did not mean idle time, it meant shifting the work indoors. Quilting, whittling, basket weaving, harness repair, and tool sharpening filled the short, cold days when field work was impossible. These were not leisure activities in the modern sense, they were productive necessities disguised as evening pastimes, producing goods the family needed and could not otherwise afford to buy. As manufactured goods became cheap and abundant, this instinct to produce rather than purchase quietly disappeared, replaced by passive entertainment that produces nothing at all. A quilt made across a long winter was not simply a blanket, it was a family history stitched together from worn-out clothing that could no longer be mended, each patch a memory of a garment that had already served its full life. Whittling taught patience and precision to boys long before any classroom did, and a well-made basket, woven from willow or reed gathered along a creek bed, could last for years of daily use, carrying eggs, vegetables, and firewood without ever costing the family a single coin. Number 16. Barter before you spend. Cash was scarce in rural communities, especially during the Depression, so communities ran on trade. A dozen eggs for a sack of flour, a day of labor for a repaired fence, a jar of preserves for a bundle of firewood. This web of mutual obligation held communities together in ways that pure cash transactions never could, because it built ongoing relationships of trust rather than one-time exchanges. Modern banking and credit systems, along with certain barter taxation policies introduced later in the century, made informal trade legally complicated and socially unfamiliar, quietly severing a form of community connection that had bound neighbors together for generations. Number 15. Learn the wild things that grow for free. Dandelion greens, wild onions, poke salad, cattail roots, and dozens of other wild edibles were not desperate last resorts, they were regular parts of the diet for families who knew where and when to look. This knowledge required careful, hands-on teaching, because getting it wrong with the wrong plant could be dangerous, so it was passed with real seriousness from parent to child. As grocery stores expanded their reach into even the most rural corners of the country, foraging became viewed as something poor people did rather than something smart people did, and the knowledge nearly vanished within 2 generations. A child would be walked along a fence line or a creek bank and shown, patiently, which leaf was safe and which one merely looked similar, a lesson repeated season after season until it became instinct rather than memory. There was real seriousness in this teaching, none of the casual attitude modern foraging trends sometimes carry, because a mistake with the wrong root or the wrong berry could genuinely cost a life. That seriousness is exactly why the knowledge, once lost, is so hard to simply pick back up from a book alone. Number 14 was quietly discouraged, and in some places outright restricted, not because it was unsafe, but because it threatened profit. Raw milk, sold directly from a family cow or a neighbor's small herd, was once a normal part of rural life, and many families believed firmly in its nutritional value. Beginning in the mid-20th century, a wave of regulation swept across many states, driven heavily by lobbying from large-scale dairy processors who could not compete with the low-cost, direct-to-neighbor model of a family with 2 or 3 cows. Pasteurization requirements, while genuinely useful for large-scale commercial dairy safety, were applied in ways that made small-scale, trusted, local sales of raw milk illegal or nearly impossible in many regions, even when the health risks in a small, known herd were dramatically different from those in an industrial dairy operation. Whatever your view on raw milk today, the history is clear. A genuine safety concern was used, in part, to eliminate small competitors, and a piece of rural self-sufficiency was quietly legislated out of existence. Families who kept a single milk cow were not running an industrial operation. They knew that animal personally, its health, its diet, its habits, in a way no factory farm inspector ever could know a herd of thousands. The trust between a family and their own cow was built through daily contact, not through a government stamp on a carton, and for many rural households, that direct relationship with their own food source was worth more than any convenience the store could offer. Number 13. Sharpen everything, always. A dull knife, a dull axe, a dull hoe was not just inefficient, it was dangerous, requiring more force and inviting more accidents. Sharpening stone sat by the back door of nearly every farmhouse, and running a blade across one before use was as automatic as locking a door is today. This habit of constant maintenance extended to everything a family owned, because replacing a tool was expensive and repairing it was nearly always possible. Disposable culture, encouraged heavily by manufacturers who profit far more from replacement than repair, has made maintenance feel like an unnecessary chore rather than the basic responsibility it once was. Number 12 is another main event, so pay close attention here. Know exactly how much you actually need, and never confuse want with need. This sounds simple, almost too simple to be a survival rule, but it shaped every single decision a Depression-era family made. Before buying anything, before planting anything, before committing time or money to anything, the question was always the same: do we truly need this to survive the coming season, or do we simply want it? This clarity of thought prevented waste, prevented debt, and kept families from the kind of overextension that ruined so many households during boom years right before the crash hit in 1929. Advertising, in the decades since, has built an entire industry around deliberately blurring this exact line, convincing people that wants are needs through relentless, sophisticated psychological messaging. Families who still practice this rule today, consciously separating genuine need from manufactured want before every purchase, report significantly lower financial stress and significantly higher savings, according to modern financial behavior research that essentially confirms what your grandparents already understood instinctively. There was a particular kind of quiet confidence in a household that lived this way, a lack of the constant low-grade anxiety that comes from wondering whether you can actually afford the life you are living. They did not need budgeting apps or spreadsheets to achieve this. They needed only a habit of pausing, every single time, and asking the one honest question that most modern spending completely skips. Now here is something that might make even the most self-reliant among you uncomfortable. Not everything your grandparents did was actually wise by modern understanding, and pretending otherwise does this history a disservice.
Okay.
Some
Is
old
this
home
grateful
remedies
yet?
were genuinely
Almost. Throw yours
dangerous.
in here.
Some old farming practices depleted soil in ways we are still repairing today, and some old attitudes toward outsiders and change were rooted more in fear than in wisdom. The goal here is not blind nostalgia. It is honest recovery of what actually worked, sorted carefully from what simply happened to be common at the time. That honesty is what makes the knowledge worth trusting in the first place. Number 11. Keep a garden even when you do not need one. Depression-era families who survived best were rarely the ones who started gardening once hunger arrived. They were the ones who had never stopped gardening in the first place. A working garden, tended consistently through good years and bad, meant the skills, the soil health, and the seed stock were already the instant they were truly needed. Victory gardens during the war years proved just how quickly ordinary families could feed themselves when given a small plot and the will to use it, with millions of these gardens producing a significant portion of the nation's vegetables at their peak. The decline of home gardening in the prosperous decades that followed left most Americans with soil they had never touched and seeds they would not know how to save. A well-kept garden was also a kind of insurance policy that paid dividends every single season rather than sitting idle until disaster struck, providing fresh vegetables through summer, preserved goods through winter, and a steady supply of seed for the following year. Children raised tending these gardens grew up with an entirely different relationship to food than children raised entirely on store-bought produce, understanding intuitively that a tomato does not simply appear, it is grown, tended, and earned through weeks of patient daily work.
Number 10. Save every seed worth saving.
Before seed companies dominated the market, families saved seeds from their strongest, healthiest plants every single season, slowly developing varieties perfectly suited to their specific soil and climate over the years. This practice created genuine, if informal, agricultural resilience, a diversity of locally adapted plants that could withstand regional pests, droughts, and diseases far better than any uniform commercial variety. The consolidation of the seed industry into a small number of large corporations in the decades since has dramatically reduced this genetic diversity, and heirloom seed preservation groups today are working urgently to recover varieties that were nearly lost entirely within living memory.
Number 9. Cook with what you have, not what a recipe demands.
Depression-era cooking was defined by flexibility rather than precision, because a family could not simply run to the store for a missing ingredient. Recipes were guidelines, not rules, and a good cook could substitute, stretch, and improvise a meal from whatever the pantry actually contained that week. This kind of culinary confidence has largely disappeared in an age of exact recipes, delivery apps, and the assumption that any ingredient is always just one purchase away. A cook in this era understood the underlying logic of a dish rather than simply following a fixed set of steps, knowing that flour could stretch a stew, that a handful of cornmeal could turn a thin soup into something filling, that nearly any vegetable on hand could be worked into a pie crust if the fruit ran short. That kind of improvisational confidence in the kitchen is a genuine skill, built through necessity, and it is one of the more quietly valuable things this list has to offer anyone willing to actually practice it.
Number 8. Teach children real work early.
Children in this era were not shielded from labor, they were folded into it from a young age, gathering eggs, hauling water, weeding gardens, and minding younger siblings. This was not exploitation in the way modern eyes sometimes assume, it was preparation, building competence, confidence, and a genuine understanding of where food and comfort actually come from. Modern childhood, structured heavily around school and screen time, has produced generations with far less hands-on practical competence at the same age, a gap that many parents today are only now beginning to notice and try to correct.
Number 7.
Store more than you think you will need, but never more than you can rotate. A well-stocked pantry was not hoarding, it was insurance against a bad harvest, a hard winter, or a sudden loss of income. But smart families understood rotation, always using the oldest stores first and replacing them steadily, so nothing sat forgotten until it spoiled. This discipline of rotation is the part most modern prepping culture forgets entirely,
different from the others.
focusing on stockpiling quantity while ignoring the quiet, patient system that actually kept old-world pantries useful year after year.
Number 6. Repair relationships as carefully as you repair tools.
Community was not optional in this era, it was infrastructure. Neighbors who helped bring in each other's harvest, who sat with each other's sick children, who shared tools and labor freely, created a safety net far more reliable than any government program of the time. This required active, ongoing maintenance, forgiving small slights, showing up for others even when inconvenient, and understanding that isolation was a genuine danger, not merely an inconvenience. The rise of suburban privacy and digital connection in the decades since has left many people more isolated than any Depression-era family, despite having vastly more material comfort. A barn raising or a harvest gathering was not simply a social event, it was a practical necessity dressed up as a celebration, because certain tasks were nearly impossible for a single family to complete alone, and the labor exchanged that day would be repaid, without question, the next time a neighbor needed the same help. This created a genuine, felt sense of belonging that modern research now links directly to both longevity and mental health, something entire communities once built without ever naming it as a wellness strategy at all. Let us step back for a moment and look at the larger picture, because a pattern emerges once you line these 25 rules up side by side. Nearly every single one of them was eventually replaced by something that had to be purchased, subscribed to, or regulated, rather than something that could simply be known and done.
Home canning gave way to grocery store shelves.
Yes, look at that, we did
Mending
it!
gave way to fast fashion.
Community mutual aid gave way to insurance premiums and government programs. Raw milk gave way to processed dairy under new legal pressure. This was not one single conspiracy with one single villain, it was the slow, steady result of an economy that profits enormously when people forget how to do things for themselves, and profits even more when that forgetting feels like progress rather than loss. Recognizing that pattern does not mean rejecting modern life entirely. It simply means understanding exactly what was traded away, and deciding, deliberately, what deserves to be reclaimed. Number 5. Know the value of a full night's rest and an early morning start. Farm life ran on daylight, not on convenience, which meant early bedtimes and early mornings were simply the rhythm of survival rather than a discipline problem to be solved. This natural rhythm, tied closely to actual sunlight rather than artificial light, produced deep, consistent sleep that modern sleep researchers now recognize as far healthier than the fragmented, late-night patterns common today. Electric lighting, and later television and screens, quietly pushed bedtimes later across the entire culture, and modern sleep science is only now catching up to what a farmhouse schedule always assumed as basic common sense. Number 4. Never show your full hand in hard times. Families going through genuine hardship often kept up appearances deliberately, mending clothes carefully so the patches barely showed, keeping a clean and orderly home even when the pantry was nearly empty. This was not dishonesty, it was dignity, and a practical strategy too, because appearing desperate could invite predatory lenders or unwanted pity that sometimes did more harm than good. There is real wisdom in this rule, but also real caution needed, because pride taken too far can prevent a family from accepting help they genuinely need. The old rule was never about refusing help entirely, it was about protecting dignity while still knowing exactly who could be trusted enough to ask. A worn but carefully mended coat sent a very different message to a landlord or a lender than a torn and neglected one, even when both families were, in truth, struggling equally hard behind closed doors. This was survival instinct dressed as pride, a recognition that how you presented yourself to the world genuinely affected how the world treated you back, especially in an era with far fewer formal safety nets to fall back on. Number 3, and this is a main event, so give it your full attention. Diversify everything, income, food sources, and skills, because a single point of failure is the single greatest danger any family can carry. Families who survived the Depression best were rarely the ones with the most money before the crash, they were the ones with the most varied means of provision, a garden, a few animals, a trade skill, a bit of cash savings, and a network of neighbors who could help fill any single gap. When one source failed, a poor harvest, a lost job, a sick animal, the others carried the family through. Modern economic life has pushed many households toward the opposite extreme, a single job, a single income stream, and a complete dependence on stores and supply chains that assume everything will always function smoothly. Recent years have shown just how quickly that assumption can break down, and financial advisors are increasingly, if quietly, recommending the same diversified resilience that a Depression-era family considered basic common sense. Think about what that actually looked like day to day, a father working a wage job in town 3 days a week, a mother tending a garden and a small flock of hens that fed the family and brought in a little egg money besides, a teenage son who could repair a harness or a fence for a neighbor in exchange for seed or flour. No single failure could take down the whole household at once, because the household was never resting its full weight on a single point. That is resilience in its truest, most practical form, and it is worth asking honestly how many of us could say the same about our own lives today. Number 2. Keep detailed, honest records of everything that matters. Ledgers tracking exactly what was planted, what was harvested, what was spent, and what was owed were kept meticulously by families with very little formal education, because uncertainty about your own situation was a luxury nobody could afford. This habit of honest, careful record-keeping created clarity that prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic surprises. Modern financial confusion, with many households unsure exactly what they earn, spend, or owe in any given month, stands in sharp contrast to this old, disciplined habit of always knowing your true position. A farm ledger from this era, if you ever have the chance to see one in person, is a remarkable document, columns of tight handwriting tracking every egg sold, every bushel harvested, every debt owed to a neighbor and every debt a neighbor owed in return. Nothing was left to memory or assumption, because memory fades and assumption is exactly how small problems quietly become large ones. And now, number 1, the final rule, and the one that actually explains every single rule that came before it. Number 1 is simply this: act as though tomorrow depends on what you do today, because it genuinely does. Every single practice on this list, the canning, the mending, the fire banking, the seed saving, the honest bookkeeping, the community bonds, all of it flows from a single underlying mindset rather than any individual trick or technique. It is the deep, quiet understanding that comfort is not guaranteed, that ease is not owed to anyone, and that the work you do today is the only real insurance against the hardship that tomorrow might bring. This is not pessimism. It is not fear. It is a clear-eyed, practical respect for reality, built by people who had already watched comfortable lives collapse almost overnight, and who refused to be caught unprepared a second time. Every other rule on this list is simply this philosophy applied to a specific problem, whether the problem was hunger, cold, isolation, or uncertainty. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it means none of these 25 habits were ever really separate from each other. The banked fire and the root cellar and the mended shirt were all the same idea, wearing different clothes, a refusal to let tomorrow arrive and find you empty-handed. That refusal was not loud or dramatic. It looked like an ordinary evening, a woman darning a sock by lamplight, a man sharpening a blade before bed, a child learning which plant along the creek was safe to eat. Small, quiet, unremarkable acts, repeated so consistently that they became the invisible architecture holding an entire family upright through years that would have broken most modern households in a matter of weeks. If this knowledge keeps disappearing at the pace it has over the last several decades, an entire way of surviving hardship, tested across generations of genuine crisis, will exist nowhere except old letters, old photographs, and the fading memories of people who are, every single year, growing fewer in number. That is not a small loss. That is the quiet disappearance of an entire operating manual for hard times, right at a moment when hard times seem to be returning. So here is your challenge, and it is a small one, deliberately so.
Sounds good to me.
Pick
Glad we
just
could
one
work it
rule
out.
from this list. Just one.
See the shape
Maybe
of
it
this
is
leaf,
starting a
sweetie?
small garden bed
It's
this
different from the
weekend.
others.
Maybe it is learning to sharpen your own kitchen knives properly. Maybe it is calling a grandparent or an older neighbor and simply asking them how they used to do things, before it is too late to ask at all. Do that one thing this week, then come back and tell everyone watching exactly what you learned and exactly how it went. Knowledge that stays only in comments and
Here's your
conversations
flour
tends to fade
and the
again
eggs.
within a generation.
Much obliged.
But knowledge that gets practiced, even just once, even just imperfectly, has a way of taking root and staying alive. If this kind of history matters to you, the kind that lives in hands and habits rather than in textbooks, subscribe and stay close, because there is a great deal more of it still waiting to be uncovered before it disappears for good.